Welcome to Noble, a network of owners, business leaders, and entrepreneurs. Here, we focus on the 5 stages of business: launching an idea, establishing a business, hiring employees, creating leaders, and then expanding your impact. We hope you enjoy today's session.
It's nice to be able to be here and have a little bit more voice than I normally have. The last week or so, I've been struggling with cold issues and things, and I think for many folks, health is certainly a crisis event at some point in our lives, and we're going to kind of unpack um, the course of crisis and understand and become aware of the precipitating event that begins, as well as how we live through it, and then how do we come out of it on the other side, and then how can we relate to folks. Um, this is part of a very intensive training that I received a few years ago. I had 50 hours of supervised training in St. Louis, Missouri, through the Stephen Ministry Organization. We had in our church a professional counselor, a licensed counselor who just had a passion for allowing the members of the church, of the body, to be equipped to provide care to people in a non-licensed but yet certified in a supervisory type of caregiving for folks that are in a variety of life issues. And for many folks, for some people, one experience they consider to be the end of the world crisis, and for other people, it's just a bump in the road. And so this is going to be a very hands-on and a very kind of under the hood and a very in your gut, in your heart kind of conversation. I'm going to share a few things personally that have been going on and are currently going on that are crisis, and just kind of talk through what it's like to have that happen, and then walk through how do you not allow it to bury you, because I think for many people that can become a paralyzing, crippling, debilitating kind of event. So one of the things that is really helpful is to kind of talk through what we're going to learn today, and what we want to do is to live in the crisis, but not be paralyzed by it. And this is something that's really not unusual in Scripture, whether you're looking in the Old Testament or the New Testament, that all of God's people, regardless of their level of maturity or leadership or commitment to the church, they all were experiencing some kind of crisis, a trial, a tribulation, a temptation. Um, self, some brought on by their own decisions, others brought on by their circumstances. Um, so we're going to learn to live in that. The second thing we're going to do is to go beyond the cause. It's so easy when when you find yourself having made a mistake, and you find yourself in a bad situation, and all of a sudden it was just a problem. Now it's a big problem. Now it's a crisis, to kind of keep going back and blaming and trying to keep staying back in the cause, why this happened, and not getting past that. And it's hard to jump from there to get to solutions, because it's really important to look at solutions, not just ones that help self-regulate and help numb the pain of the crisis, but actually are lasting solutions so that you don't have this happen again. And then the third thing we're going to do is we're going to look at some biblical relating skills and how we can apply those to people that are experiencing crisis. We're going to ask some very specific questions that are for ourselves and for people that are in our life that we need to be asking, because there needs to be a moment of truth that needs to be told to folks who are in crisis. Even though there are things that are hard to say, there are truths that need to be heard. And so let's talk a little bit about the definition of crisis. And by the way, as I'm speaking, some of you may have received the Holmes Ray stress inventory. If you're welcome to do that. If you haven't filled it out, you're welcome to do that while I'm talking. I'm not upset or offended, because I want you to have some sense of your scores when we get to that point. So one of the things in terms of the definition of crisis is that point in time when it's decided whether any kind of an affair or any kind of course of action must go on, or if it needs to be modified, or if the course of action needs to be terminated. It's a decisive moment. It's a crucial time, and it's a stage or an event. And so just looking at that first definition, this is from, early in the Webster's Dictionary. This is the definition of crisis. And, it's something that it's very specific. But As you read that definition, is there something that comes to your mind that you think of where there's a course of action that you've been on and you have to make a decision? It's time for us to, we got to do something. This is not working. This is a problem. We need to modify it or terminate. Um, there's a moment of truth or a come to Jesus. Does somebody have something that in your life that you think of or know of that you wanted to share? All right. Well, I was just thinking a little bit about Jeff. We talked about at the beginning of the call where he's had several moments where things are going back and forth, and with his brother and some other things he shared. So it's just there's a lot of times when we have these courses of action um, that make a decision whether we need to make adjustments or whether we need to terminate. A second point in the definition is a turning point in a disease, indicating whether there's going to be recovery or death. I'm thinking about this, story of the beginning of a visit from St. Nicholas, the story of the beginning of that, the behind that when the author had a daughter who was having a really bad fever and he was away and she wanted a book by St. Nicholas. And in the story, the doctor comes in and basically says, it's a tough decision right now. We don't know whether she's going to make the turn or not. And it's just kind of up to God whether she's going to make it because her fever is so high, she's so sick. Um, we're at that crisis moment. She's either going to come through it or she's not, and it's very poignant. I know I had a grandmother that had a stroke, and we had that conversation with the doctor when she was unable to communicate, and we were unable to. She was able to hear us, but couldn't communicate back to us. And I remember that feeling of, wow, she may not come out of here. And that's a really big crisis moment of a reality that we just weren't prepared for. And then a third part of the definition is a situation whose outcome decides whether possible bad consequences will follow. And so sometimes a crisis is not necessarily going to be bad, or until we know some crises are good. Um, they are difficult to go through, but they provide good results. But there are many times, though, when a situation is going to be decided whether possible bad consequences are going to follow. You think about those times in terms of temptation or those terms in terms of a mistake. When you see somebody that's going down the wrong road and you just think they're not, this is not good for them. I met a guy last night in line dancing who shared with me he went to his first AA meeting and he is got to that kind of admitting his need for help because he had somebody tell him about the bad consequences that were happening in his life and were about to happen. And he was at a crisis moment to decide that he needed to take care of that. Here's a couple of other examples of a definition of crisis coming out of a different, not just um, Webster's dictionary, but from the mental health area. There's crises arising out of some change in a person's life space that produces a modification of their relationships with others and or their perception of themselves. Think about the people that are in your own life and how many times when you've seen them change through repentance, through hitting rock bottom, through having a kind of an intervention. Um, my accountant had to have a come to Jesus talk with one of his daughters, and he shared with me that she needed to have that moment to have that change in relationship. She had some issues. Another definition is the person's internal reaction to a perceived external hazard. There's so many things that are going on inside of us that we don't, sometimes we know that are going on in us, and there's sometimes that we don't know. And when we have a perceived external hazard that we're feeling as a threat, then we may begin to internalize some feelings and some preparation of responses in reaction to what we perceive as a hazard. There's a tremendous amount of this challenge just in terms of I think since social media has become so prevalent and the use of our phones, The degree of mental health, even coming out of COVID, we're going to talk about that a little bit too, is just unpacked and just exponentially blown up people's perceived feelings about the hazards of COVID and social distancing and all that stuff. So there's been a tremendous amount of mental health issues that have come because of um, our feelings of crisis. Oops, my sharing stopped. There we go. Sorry. Um, let's see. I've lost my slide view. It went to Megan. There we go. Sorry, I hit the wrong button. Um, I found out recently, this is something John F. Kennedy had shared when he was president, that the symbol for the word for crisis in the Chinese language is a combination of two words. One stands for danger and the other is for opportunity. And I really liked this, even though some think it's a misperception or misconstrued today, but I do believe that there is certainly an opportunity for people to transcend and to persevere through their crisis. But there's also a moment of danger where they're going to potentially either not be able to get out of it or be stuck in it. Um, this is just an example of what crisis can provide. Think about in your own life when people ask you, "Hey, how things going?" And you try to think about, hey, things are good. I'm pretty fine, normal. There's a variety of four-letter words that you use to describe how things are going. And I think that for a lot of folks, we just like there to be stability. We just want, for once, not to have something go wrong. Just not to have, I talk to some people that are in crisis and every day is one of those days. And I hear that a lot. That's just it's one of these days. I mean, I've heard it too much. And I don't disagree that it's one of those days you can have those, but some people live their life in crisis. And for them, if they're not on the bottom picture, if their triangle's not tipped over, if they're not living in crisis constantly, for them, they don't feel normal. In fact, to feel normal, to feel like there's nothing wrong is a problem. You may know somebody like that they're just a revolving cyclone of crisis moments nonstop. And it's just kind of it seems like trouble follows them everywhere. Whether they make the mistake or something happens to them, it doesn't matter what, they can't catch a break. And so there's this constant battle of trying to make sure that we're balancing brokenness and wholeness. And there are so many things in Scripture where Jesus is calling us to be broken and to be repentant and to be humble and to, in a way, be in crisis. To trust him by faith, and is in many ways all of our early disciples and apostles they lived in crisis. They put themselves in crisis so that faith could be seen and experienced. And so these are some of the things that we try to balance is our taking control of ourselves and in our crises and allowing the Spirit to help guide us as well. So there's a variety of different crisis moments. We're going to talk about two specifically. Um, One of these are developmental crises. These are things that are going to eventually happen. They tend to last for a longer period of time than other crises, and they're not as intense as we're looking at accidental in a minute. But when you think of a development crisis, I've got a couple of examples here below. And at some point, we're going to die. Um, you you can think about since November, how many people that you personally know have succumbed to an illness, whether that was a terminal illness or a sudden death. How many people do you know who have gone into retirement and have, found themselves extremely stressed, unable to be settled, needing to go back to work? How many of you have had a change in work responsibilities, work habits, management? And but for many, we have folks who've started into school. They're into their spring semester in college, or perhaps they're getting ready to end their senior year in high school, or they're an adult and they're going back to, community college. There's a lot of crisis that happens when you are involved in schooling, moving. I mean, I think you ask anybody, moving is an absolute crisis. It's a panic mode, and no one wants to ever sell their house or move because moving itself is a disaster. They can't stand it. It's a crisis. And then you have chronic illness and disease. Um, that just, I have type 2 diabetes. I remember the first 6 months of that I was in crisis. I was in an absolute just, man, I mean, it was a whirlwind of emotion. But what are some other crises? If you want to put in the chat, you're welcome to put a couple of crises, things that are developmental, that have eventually happened that you went through. Please share in the chat. Um, I've got folks who've been bought out, I see here, where that you lost the job. It's going to be ending we have a job that's ending in March. We've got people, who are going to be having to move. My oldest daughter and her boyfriend were living together in an apartment, and they had both lost their jobs and had not uh, gotten other work, and consequently they lost their apartment, were evicted, and so they're both of them are living back with my daughter's living with me, and my wife and her boyfriend lives with his mom, and they are, absolutely in a death crisis too. So lots of work changes and things that happen. Another example, excuse me, is accidental crises. These are things that aren't supposed to happen. Um, Things that just really, you just look at God and say, this isn't right. This isn't fair. Um, I've been faithful. I've been doing everything right. And why did you let this happen? Sometimes you're that way to God, about something that's going on. Um, I know one of the guys in the church I was at Grove City. He had um, he was a good guy, but he suffered from some mental paranoia, and he uh, was in the process of divorcing his wife, and he invited her over one day, and he stabbed her. Went out in the front. He stabbed her when she came into the house, killed her, took her outside. Um, in the grass and called the police and put a sheet over her, and he stood inside waiting for the police to arrest him, and I visited him in jail a few times, um, and just, you know an absolute real crisis of that dimension, that's not supposed to happen. um, Having an injury, having a very serious injury, that has fallen, that you might have had, that's not supposed to happen. We get hurt. Being fired, we don't go to work and get a job with the purpose of being fired, but when it happens, it's like that, that there's that not supposed to happen feeling. Same thing with foreclosure, bankruptcy. We don't buy a house with the intention not to pay it, but things like that happen. We've also got examples of a couple of other kinds of crises that happen. One of those are social cultural. These are crises that really came about in the COVID era, very, very strong, and there's some industries and there's some facets that really thrive and make money and benefit based upon the amount of crises that can happen. Think about the upheaval of society, the upheaval of, you pick any kind of political movement, pick any kind of, think about the BLM riots in the 20s, think about just all of the social unrest that has happened over, since the 60s, those social cultural crises that happen because of these changes in beliefs and practices. Um, and many times they're temporary, but they can be very altering. So that's a different type of crises. And then we also have, get the next one, uh, adventitious crisis, things that are going to happen naturally. There's been a lot of those. Think about the floods down in North Carolina. Think about the floods in Tennessee and in Kentucky. Think about the terrorism things, violent crime, the MS-13 gangs. Think about all those things that have been on the news this last year or so. It's been a bunch of crises. Again, those are different kinds of crises that, we just don't control, and you find yourself in it. You just are like, wow, this has been huge the last few months. So Any questions or comments anyone to bring up before I move on to the Holmes Ray? Any observations about the crises? All right. Um, let's take a look at your Holmes Ray answers for a little bit. Let's just take a peek in there, and I want to see what you guys thought of this. How many of you guys, I mean, just probably, if you want to either raise your hand or just tell me if you've never taken this kind of assessment, a Holmes, it's a stress inventory. If you've never done it, anybody like not done this before? Okay. Um, this is really a really neat tool. It was developed in 1967. Most of these social science inventories were started as a military operation. A lot of personality and things were started as a military, or that was tested on military. Um, the stressful life events that we can look at that contribute to crises. Some of these events themselves are crises. Others of them are a combination of things that contribute to stress. So basically, it's a scale of 11 is the least stressful, all the way up to 100, and you can see those top five on that scale are very life altering. And if you've experienced those higher ones, you know how impactful they can be on your health. Um, and part of the premise of doing this kind of an assessment is to look at adjustments that might need to take place so that you can be aware of the degree that stress is in your life. And this is also looking over the course of the last year. So when you think back of January or February of 2024 through today, and you just add up all of those events, what's that put you in terms of a predictor for health in the next 2 years? So who wants to share what you don't have to give me the actual number, but was there anybody under 150? I could be curious. Oh, wow. So Megan and Susie have low stress, or at least their chance of suffering from stress is low.
I'm not married. That probably helps.
Okay. Okay. So that's a good point. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of marriage stress things on there.
Mhm.
Anybody in the from 150 to 299? Level that in terms of that stress scale.
That would be me. I also am not married. So
Oh, okay. But yours is higher. Yours is higher, but you're not married. Okay. And who's over 300? Anybody over 300?
Corey.
We have one. Okay. All right. Well, these kinds of scales are not a judgment. They are not a rightness or wrongness. They're simply just an indicator. It's just an inventory of features. And so, what of the things that you found in there, which one stood out to you? You're kind of surprised, or you were like, "Wow, that really does have that you agree with or have observations on." Any of them stood out to you of the ones that you checked?
I was shocked that some of these were on here, honestly, because I would think they were happy things, but I guess, it could cause stress as you're going into it.
Mm-hmm.
Like those who just got married. Of course, that's high stress time. That first year is like crazy, but it's also happy. Um, Pregnancy can be high stress, but also a happy thing. Vacation though, and major holidays being on there was like, even though they were lower, it was just like, how's vacation a stressor?
That's a great question. Why do you think that happy things or positive things can be stressful? I don't know. Why do you think that is?
I think the two items that she brought up, vacation and major holidays, it's because it's putting your family together in a tight space for a long period of time potentially, and those relationships can be hard.
And
And
major
there's also
family or major holidays, if you've lost a family member or if there's any like tension, like between family members or friends, I thought maybe that would be something that's on there, like any just relationship issues with friends or family as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
That makes total sense. And I've dealt with stress on that myself.
Yeah,
Okay.
for some families, there's no crisis on day one. On day two, there's some stress, but by day three, we're in crisis. You gotta go. It's time to go. You know, my family, we have a 3-day rule. I don't care what it is. 3 days is it. Good or bad or otherwise, good relationships or bad 3 days is it. And it's time for us to go back to our home bases. So otherwise we're going to have a crisis moment. So
Good to know your limits.
yes, know those. All right, let's look at a Christian perspective. We're going to spend some time a little bit in this, marinating in just a little bit in scripture. I want to make sure that we're not, not everyone's a believer that you'll be interfacing with. And I want to just, for those of us that are believers, I want us to be aware that we may look at this differently than those who don't know the Lord, and we might not be as reactive and be willing to stay here in this moment. But it is, in terms of Greek, it is the word crisis is judgment. It's Jesus talks about this a lot, and um, when he came to this earth and when he was doing his ministry, it was a time, it was a time of judgment, a time of repentance, of time of reflection and decision. It was that turning point. Think about it. When Jesus was on earth, was there a more of a crisis moment when he was on the cross and when he was crucified? Was there a more poignant crisis moment where death is going to be overcome? I mean, I can't think of any point in the world's history where in our earth where the crisis moment wasn't more pronounced than on the cross when Jesus was crucified and when he rose from the dead. That period which way is it going to go? Of doubt. So we're going to look at Matthew 10 here for a little bit, and then there's a Christian proclamation. For those of us that are in crisis, people who don't know the Lord will look at us and how are we when we're in crisis? Are we in sackcloth and ashes? Are we, are we down? Are we downtrodden? Do we not look? Do we feel defeated? Do we isolate ourselves? When you're going through a crisis, do you totally want to be alone? Do you want to just push everyone away? As a believer, you really need to make sure remember that you're not alone and not allow yourself to be isolated, because you need to give yourself an opportunity to be free to experience growth through the crisis. And that's almost an unusual thing, is to think, how can I be free? I'm buried. I'm pushed down. I don't know what to do. How do I be free to experience growth through this? Think about, Job is another great example. I mean, you talk about a guy who had crisis. I mean, just make a list. He had crisis after crisis after. I mean, he's an endless crisis thing. But yet, look at how he grew and what God did through him to grow through those experiences. Another wonderful example, I think, is through the Experiencing God material through Henry Blackaby. I really encourage some of you to consider this. This is a great study in looking at how God reveals himself and his will, where God is at work in the world around you, and that he invites us to join him in relationship, and he invites us to participate in his work, and he speaks to us through the Bible, through prayer, through circumstances, through the church, through other believers. He speaks to us. He prophesies to us. Other believers provide a prophetic word. And that word, we have to decide if we're going to believe it or not. It's a crisis of belief that requires faith and action. We have to decide what we're going to do with this word that we've received. And then we have to adjust our life accordingly and then be obedient and to experience what the Lord has for us. And so there's just a moment when we truly are being transformed and renewed by Christ in the Spirit, that we have to allow him to do his work through us and adjust ourselves so we can obey and experience that forgiveness and that getting through it. Oops. Jesus reminds us that he didn't come to earth to bring peace but a sword. He came to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, a man against, his enemies will be members of his own household. Jesus says, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and anyone who loves the son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy. Whoever finds their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. That verse 39 is like the triangle, isn't it? It's like Jesus is wanting us to tip our triangle over and let him balance it. He's like, you need to know that if you're going to be my disciple, I've come to bring a sword. I've come to bring judgment. I've come to decide for you. If you're truly following me, I'm your I'm your father, I'm your mother. And following me is, and so think about the family relationships that are strained because you are a believer and you're following Jesus full forth. Chaz shared a really fun story about one of his family members that has come to know the Lord and is continuing to grow in his faith. And I know Chaz would not ever abandon his faith and following Christ for anyone. I mean, all of us that are believers will not. And I've told my daughter and her boyfriend, until you're married in a godly marriage, I'm not going to acknowledge your, boyfriends don't have husband privileges. And I've had some very strong words with my son-in-law. I call him son-in-law, and he's not. You're not my son-in-law. You're just a guy that is spending time with my daughter, but fortunately he's been choosing Christ and he's making that transition. But Jesus, made it very clear that if we're going to follow him, it means judgment. He's come not to bring peace but a sword, and that Christ is loved above all other values and relationships. And for some of us, maybe that's part of why we're having trouble with the crisis is that we're in, is that we're not putting Jesus at the front, and we don't love him above our husband and our wife and our children. Think about the people that are enabling their adult children and others to make poor decisions because we're not making Jesus our Lord. We're making our kids our Lord, our job our Lord, other things. You just can't have other authorities. You also have to be remembered to be aware and ready to go through the crisis. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the stages. I'm going to be honoring our time here. I might go a little bit quicker. This is something I just typed in Google just to see what happened, and I was fascinated to see the stages and the phases. So this is sort of similar to what we're going to talk about, where we go through the course of crisis. There's a beginning, there's a middle part, there's a part where you have to decide how to respond and then how you resolve it and get through it and then recover. And then there's certain phases, and what we're going to talk about is a little bit similar to this. So the beginning part of the course, and this is the course, it's basically 5, sometimes there are 6 different phases or stages that you go through, but there's a particular external or precipitating event that happens that's changing what's changing something that's normal. And then before you react, you have this internal reaction. And for some of you, is that internal reaction a heart reaction or is it a head reaction? Tell me which way do you tend to react instantly when that external or change is happening? Do you think with your head first, or do you feel with your heart? How many of you are head thinkers, where you're thinking about this thing that's happening? How many of you are absolute feelers, and it's on the sleeve and it comes off, and it's like, oh my, and you don't care what it is. It's just the feeling's coming out. It's coming out now, and it's unfiltered. There is no filter. The feeling's out there. Then we have this third action to adjust. We have to figure out how to adjust to this new change. And then we get to this fork in the road decision. And then the final thing is this new equilibrium. So remember the triangle at the beginning is equilibrium, is having it flat and level, where we're balancing our brokenness and wholeness, and everything's normal. And we have to get to this new equilibrium. Here's another example I think is a little more illustrative. You have equilibrium at the top where you have the triangle. That's stability. It's one of the most stable things it's created geometrically. Then you have this precipitating an event that sort of shakes you a little bit, that you're not sure how to feel about it. Sorry, push the wrong button there. And then we have all of a sudden the triangle's upside down. So think about that crisis experience that you've had or that you're in, and then what you begin to do is to try, you attempt tried and true solutions. What are those things you've done before? What's an example of something that's happened and you've attempted things before and it just didn't work out. I remember the first time that I had a flat tire, and I was on the way to an interview, and it was a really important job, and I had to figure out how to get there, and I didn't have a spare tire in the trunk, and it was flat. and I didn't have an air gauge, and I didn't have AAA. And so I, had to hitchhike to get to this interview. And, I avoided the crisis was momentary, but I got through it. But others of you have longer term crisis events where the tried and true solutions, they're not working. You get to this fork in the road where you either avoid the problem and you need to change, or you acknowledge the problem and you need to change. In both situations, you need to change. You're either going to avoid the problem or you're going to acknowledge it. How many of you are avoiders? How many of you, or someone that's an avoider, and there's a problem, there's something that needs to be dealt with, and I'm just I'm just going to bury it. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to get on social media. I'm going to numb out. I'm going to get busy doing something else. I'm not going to deal with this problem. I know I need to do something. I'm just not ready. I'm going to try something else. And you also try to do it alone. I don't want to tell my wife. I don't want to tell my husband. I don't want to tell my kids. I don't want to tell my friends. I need to take care of this. This is my fault. I need to do it. And I keep trying, and I keep trying, but I keep falling back, and I keep doing the same things. I've got, one of my relatives she keeps self-medicating on marijuana, and she rationalizes that helps her to deal with her struggle, and it's not solving it, and she's continuing to be in disequilibrium, and she keeps staying on the bottom, and she goes back to the top of the fork in the road, and if she hits that point, okay, she's she's got that decision to make again in the fork. Are you going to acknowledge you've got a problem and you need to change now? All right. Are you willing to turn to some others for assistance? I have a relative that is in a pregnancy right now, and she's not willing to go to PDHC and get help and have counselors who are qualified and trained to help her. She's trying to do it on her own. Instead of going to PDHC and learning some new ways of thinking and living so that she can have a new equilibrium and growth, she's not willing to do that yet. So she's still stuck in the cycle of disequilibrium. And it's very real, and it's very raw, and it's very right now for me. And you have to love these people, and you have to let them go through here, but eventually you want to get on the right road before they get to that point of no turning back. So we have this event, we have this unease, and then we need to adjust. And then we have to decide whether we're going to stay in that fork in the road of danger, where we avoid the problem, we try to do it alone, we keep working hard at applying stuff that doesn't work, and we keep staying tipped. Instead of acknowledging the problem, knowing we need to change, turning to somebody to ask for help, learning and discovering new ways of living or thinking, and then being excited about getting that triangle back restored and learning to grow again. People who are dealing with this tend to be, and you might be in that, or you might know someone is, if they're just seem to be disorganized, they're never up in a consistent time, they don't go to bed at a consistent time, they never follow through when they say they're going to do something. You just can't count on them, and they're disappointment to you, and they're disappointing, and you love them, and you want them to understand what they're doing. It seems like all they ever do is want to talk about themselves. It seems like they're just constantly, everything is about them, and they're not being selfish per se, but it seems like they can't see anything except for how it affects them. They just can't. They're irritable. One moment they seem to be normal. They're acting fine. They're happy and they're playing and they're engaged. And then all of a sudden they just get really snippy and very short-tempered. And they just don't think they can do it. They don't think they can finish college. They don't think they can stop smoking marijuana. They don't think that they can, be more than they are. They feel like they have to settle for what they've got. And, their values are unsure. They used to be, maybe they used to be a Christian. Maybe they used to attend church. Maybe they used to be part of your pickleball group. Maybe they were part of your car club. You know, they used to be involved and now they're just not. They're sort of by themselves. And they've broken relationships. They used to be close. They used to be, you know, close by. But what are some other behaviors and people that you think of or situations where that's, you know, can you guys think of people that have had this, that have struggled with this, that are dealing with crisis? And some of the things that's important for us that are going to provide care as we wrap up, you've got about 6 weeks from an event happening that you have to respond. If you're going to be with that person who's going to be on the side of helping them with the crises, you've got about 6 weeks from that event happening to help them. As you see them going through the fork in the road, um, giving them options, helping them to see those local resources that have done it. And the big one is, I tell them to put should not all over yourself. This is something you've heard before. They're going to feel guilty and beat themselves up for not dealing with their crisis moment. But you've got about 6 weeks to be able to be that person when they turn to assistance from the moment that event happens. After 6 weeks, they might become permanently stuck in that fork in the road. And the longer, after 6 weeks, they're in that fork on the road on the avoidance, the harder it is to get them out of it. So the best that you can do to help them acknowledge and change and assist is that 6 week window is your best opportunity to do it. Help them with their confusions over what to do, who they are, what the future will bring. There's a lot of uncertainty about that. And that's what faith is. It's giving us that, when we're not, it's hope for what we don't see, but certainty of what God will do for us. And part of it too is staying in the crucible as a believer. For some people, you might know they need to hit rock bottom. The crisis hasn't hurt them enough, and I've bailed them out. In fact, I've been unfortunately enabling them to stay in the crisis, and I shouldn't be. And I'm actually causing them not to get out of it because I'm helping them the wrong ways. I'm not being helpful. I need to let them decide when it's time to acknowledge and it's their time to go. But some of us, I know I was in the crucible for a while. I had a pornography addiction that was really difficult, and I went to a 180 group over at Vineyard Church for a year and a half just to help me to learn um, to acknowledge my addiction and to acknowledge my need for care and to allow people to help me. And I have an absolute, equilibrium and release from that. You may have addictions and challenges that you've had that you're in the crucible now, and God's wanting you to grow through this so that you can grow out of it. So think about these questions. What is your crisis? And this is an inventory I can provide to you if you want to email afterward. I'll give it to Susie. These are the 10 questions that you can ask yourself to figure out what brought you into it. How did it happen? And because really to get through the crisis, you need to kind of start from the beginning and get through the end. And these are the first 5 questions that you want to ask yourself. And be honest with yourself. How did it help you? How did you react to it? How did it affect you? What was be very specific about the mental, the emotional, the physical, the social, and the spiritual. And as honest as you can be with how it first affected you. Now, it may not be that way now, but it was at first, so that you can see how you've grown through it. Think about number 5, those relationships that you've had. How did that crisis affect your family, your relationship with those at work or people at church or your friends? And then think about how did you first try to resolve it? Pick that crisis in your mind and what you tried to do, and were you successful? Did it work to get out of it? Also, this is another tough one. Did anybody care for you? When you're in that crisis moment, was your mom there for you? Was your dad? Was your spouse? Who's that person that was there for you when you're in that crisis, and did they help? I have my friend Jason, I've been working with him for about 3 years as he's walking the road of divorce, and it's still not over. And I mean, it is a long journey, and I'm trying to be helpful and caring for him through that crisis. And think about the things that people did that were not helpful. And I've been that person who said the wrong thing and was not helpful. But think about the things that people that did that helped you and the things that they did not. And then how did the crisis resolve and how did you change as a result of that? So in conclusion, if you're in crisis, know that it's normal and it should be expected. If you're in crisis, know that you have the opportunity to grow and become more mature than you are now. James talks about the maturity in Ephesians 4, until we all will reach faith to the maturity of the knowledge of the Son of God, becoming like Jesus. And so we're not going to be fully mature until we're fully with Jesus. And so remember that our maturity doesn't stop because of our age or our education or our experience. God is constantly maturing us, and our crisis moments give us those opportunities to mature. And realizing it may take longer than we want to work through it. Crises aren't fun. They aren't comfortable. They're unsettling, but you can learn and grow through it if you allow yourself, I use the word marinate in it, but don't be paralyzed by it. And allow God to make the change in your heart or in your mind through you as he needs you to make. Because you know what it is that's your problem that you're being stubborn about, that Satan's using as a foothold that's keeping you in your crisis that you're not willing to let go of. And then being willing to consider new solutions. Being willing, after you admit the problem that you're struggling with and you're asking for help, and it's something that you've never tried or you've always looked down on, but you're willing to try it now through humility, be willing to consider those things. And then ask for and allow other caring Christians to help you, whether it's a Stephen minister, whether it's a professional counselor, whether it's a coach, whether it's a colleague, a friend. And if you are one of those people that are like, I scored a 10. I have no stress going on in my life. I don't have life is great. I can't think of having I remember until I had children, I never had stress. I never experienced crises. I was probably 35 or so when I actually experienced stress for the first time, and I was like not ready for it. So know that it's going to happen. And be ready to be empathetic with other believers that you know who are dealing with stress, particularly if you're part of a church. Be willing to seek out people that need to hear you and be comforted by you, and look for other opportunities to walk with others through the crises. And show them the promise of hope and deliverance. Let them see that it's not always, it's like my phrase I've said before, it won't always be this way. It won't always be this way. It's an opportunity to see that it will be through this, and help them make adequate decisions when it's necessary. Tell them the decision they need to make when they need to have that nudge. You need to make this decision. And then finally, be a triangle tipper. You as a person who's not in crisis have the opportunity to be that person to help that their triangle tipped back to equilibrium so they can feel and be able to move on from their circumstances. That's it. Any questions? Or other comments?
I have a comment. I wanted to thank you for sharing. Let me put my
Sure.
video on. Thank you for sharing that you didn't experience that crisis till much later in your life. So that just helps me to understand more. Like, why aren't people coming to Christ? Sometimes they have to go through that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
And thank you for everything that you
You're
shared. What I've
welcome.
caught. Sorry, I came on late. I couldn't find the email on my iPad. It was like 3,000 emails, and it didn't take me to the most recent for some reason. I had to like scroll till I got to the first one, the most recent. So I'll figure that out. Thank you, though. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Well, thanks for joining us, Katanya from New Jersey. That was fun.
It's great to see you, Jazz, and everyone, Susie.
I have a quick question. If you identified a family member, a person that has this crisis, this course of crisis, and it's not just an event, it's a course, right? It's been ongoing in their life. I like how you said to stay in the crucible, but and that was helpful, giving options for growth and stuff. And you can identify their level of stress, but do you have any tips about how to work with them in a way that I like how you said, allow people to help you. So instead of them turning themselves off from help, do you have any tips on how to get them around to allowing people to help them?
I think part of my strategy, Susie, is I ask them how it's going and how's your plan working. And acknowledging what they are trying to do to attempt to fix the problem, and just trying to clarify with listening skills. So you're saying that if you do this, that's going to help you with that. Is that what you're saying? And also, what will it be like what will it be like when you're through this? How will life be different if you get through this? Once this is over, once this problem's solved and this crisis is done, what will it be like? And that to me is a big piece of helping them to get the inertia to want to do the hard work of getting through it, because you want to help them what it's going to look like when you're through it. My daughter living with us and her boyfriend in a great, it's the most horrific thing that he's like in his mid-20s. It's the most horrific thing to have to move in back with mom. There's nothing that's more of a failure as a man is to move in back with mom. There's nothing worse in his world than that. And so, it's kind of, I don't say easy, but it's not hard for him to figure out what it's like to get through the crisis. Is like being independent, being able to afford to be on my own. And, oh, okay, what's your plan for doing that? And, well, this is what we're doing. And it's also too, Susie, it's not waiting for that happenstance. Oh, it's been a while, we just run into each other. It's that regular follow-up. Hey, last week you said that you had something going on, and it's taking much more periodic check-ins with the person that's in the problem with, hey, last week you said this, how's that going? It's kind of being a coach away, but it's just it's not bugging them or nagging them. It's just saying, look, you said this, and I wondered how that's going.
I think it's especially important for business owners because a lot of times it's their employees that are walking through crisis, and you want them to show up for work, but they've got these major crises in their life. So this can really help you encourage a person through the crisis and stay on board. It's tough.
Yeah.
See it a lot in businesses.
Yeah, like what Chaz mentions with the Noble Academy, your spiritual relationship first, then the family relationship or the marriage relationship, and then the finances. And any three of those things can be in a crisis or all at once. And those values, I think, knowing what the values of the person are also really helpful. If they're claim to be Christian, you have a much more of a license to ask more heartfelt questions because of their faith. If they're not a believer or an active believer, then I think you can be a little more caring, but not pushy. Like if they think you're going to try to get them back to church and whatever, that can be a turnoff. It's just how you relate to them. And how you relate is the most helpful in maintaining the relationship with them without pushing them away, and also not freaking out. I mean, think about how many times you freak out because somebody's in a crisis, and oh my God, I think you're if you don't stop this, you're gonna be addicted to heroin, and then you might want to kill yourself. Just some people get really crazy and go off the handle with the worst disaster that can happen.
All right, any other comments, questions? Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much, Jim. That was
Welcome.
really powerful.